They laughed at Jack Whittaker for adopting 3 orphaned boys, thinking he'd regret it in the end. They scoffed, muttering that a single man in his late 50s couldn't possibly handle raising 3 boys, let alone boys who had come from a world so different from his own. But Jack wasn't one to listen to whispers or entertain doubts, especially when he looked into the eyes of the boys. Caleb, the oldest at 10, Micah, 8, and little Eli, just 6, 3 brothers who had lost everything but each other. Years later, the same people who laughed at him would find themselves humbled, seeking forgiveness for their narrow minds and hard hearts. Jack didn't have time to dwell on what people thought when he first drove Caleb, Micah, and Eli to his house on the edge of Oak Hollow. The old farmhouse had seen better days, but it was sturdy and warm, just like its new owner. As they pulled up the long dirt driveway, Jack glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the boys huddled together in the back seat, clutching their small backpacks as though they might disappear. He smiled gently, trying to ease their tension. "This is home now," he said, his voice steady but kind. "Your home." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with promise and uncertainty. Caleb looked skeptical, his eyes scanning the house as though waiting for the catch. Micah fidgeted, his restless energy making it hard for him to sit still even in moments like this. And Eli, wide-eyed and quiet, pressed closer to his brothers, seeking reassurance. Jack opened the truck door, stepping out into the crisp autumn air. He waited for the boys to follow, not rushing them, letting them move at their own pace. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of freshly baked bread and pine from the fire Jack had lit in the old stone hearth. The boys entered hesitantly, their footsteps light on the worn wooden floors. Jack led them through the house, showing them the cozy living room with its mismatched furniture, the small kitchen where he'd already stocked the pantry with their favorite snacks, and finally the 3 bedrooms upstairs. Each room was simple, with a twin bed, a desk, and a dresser, but Jack had added a few touches to make them feel special. A set of toy cars for Eli, a basketball for Micah, and a set of sketch pads and pencils for Caleb, who had once mentioned he liked to draw. "This one's yours," Jack said, gesturing to each room in turn. "And you can decorate them however you like. We'll get some paint and posters next weekend, make them your own." Caleb lingered in the doorway of his room, his hand resting on the frame as though unsure if he should step inside. "It's just ours?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded. "Yours. No one's going to take it away." The adjustment wasn't easy. The boys had spent months in foster care after losing their parents in a car accident, and the trauma of that loss lingered in ways Jack couldn't always see but could certainly feel. Caleb was guarded, often retreating into himself when things felt too uncertain. Micah tested every boundary, his restless energy sometimes spilling over into defiance. Eli, the youngest, rarely spoke, his big eyes watching everything and everyone with a wariness that made Jack's heart ache. Jack wasn't perfect, but he was patient. He learned to navigate Caleb's silences, sitting beside him in the evenings and quietly sketching in his own notebook to show him it was okay to open up when he was ready. He gave Micah structure, channeling his energy into sports and chores, teaching him how to hammer a nail or build a birdhouse in the garage. And with Eli, Jack offered gentle reassurance, reading him bedtime stories and holding his hand when nightmares woke him in the middle of the night. Slowly, they began to trust him, and the farmhouse started to feel like home. But the town of Oak Hollow wasn't as welcoming. It wasn't long before the whispers started. At the diner, where Jack often stopped for coffee, Mrs. Hargrove would lean over the counter and say things like, "I just don't know how he's going to manage. 3 boys, and not even his own." At the church potluck, Mr. Simmons muttered to a group of men about raising boys from the city, as though it was some kind of scandal. Even the kids at school weren't kind, making snide comments about Caleb and his brothers during recess. Jack heard about it all, but he kept his head high and focused on what mattered, his boys. The first real test came during a trip to the grocery store. Jack had taken all 3 boys, hoping to show them that Oak Hollow wasn't all bad, but the judgmental stares and murmured comments were impossible to ignore. Caleb walked stiffly beside Jack, his face carefully blank, while Micah's usual exuberance was subdued. Eli clung to Jack's hand, his small fingers gripping tightly as though afraid to let go. At the checkout counter, Mrs. Hargrove made a pointed remark about taking on more than you can handle, but Jack only smiled and said, "These boys are my family, and that's all that matters." It wasn't always the big moments that tested them. Sometimes it was the small, quiet struggles. The nights Caleb stayed up late, worrying about things he wouldn't talk about. The times Micah came home from school with scuffed knuckles from a fight. Or the mornings when Eli refused to eat breakfast because he felt too nervous to face the day. Jack handled each challenge as best as he could, leaning on the lessons he'd learned from his own father, a man who had taught him the value of hard work, honesty, and love. Over time, small cracks began to appear in Oak Hollow's cold exterior. Mrs. Bailey, who ran the general store, noticed how polite Eli was when he said thank you every time she handed him a piece of candy. Mr. Alvarez, the baseball coach, saw how hard Micah worked during practice, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. Caleb's teacher, Mrs. Connolly, sent a note home one day saying how impressed she was with his artwork and how he had started helping other students in class. Slowly but surely, the boys were proving themselves, not through words, but through actions. Then, one summer evening, a fierce storm swept through Oak Hollow, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Trees were uprooted, roofs torn off, and power lines downed. Jack and the boys spent the following days helping neighbors clear debris and make repairs. Caleb climbed ladders alongside Jack, patching roofs and hauling shingles. Micah worked tirelessly in the yard, clearing fallen branches and hauling debris to the curb. Even little Eli helped, carrying tools and offering water to the workers. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Hargrove, who had once been one of Jack's harshest critics, watched from her porch as Eli carefully rescued her garden gnome from a pile of broken branches. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, her voice softer than Jack had ever heard it. "You're a good boy." It wasn't just Mrs. Hargrove. Neighbors who had once kept their distance began to warm up to the Whitaker family. Mr. Simmons stopped by the farmhouse one evening to thank Jack for fixing his fence after the storm, bringing a basket of fresh eggs as a token of appreciation. Mrs. Bailey invited the boys to join her grandchildren at the park, saying, "It's nice to see them making friends." But not everyone in Oak Hollow was so easily won over. There were still whispers, still sidelong glances and veiled comments at town events. One day, Jack woke up to find hateful graffiti scrawled across his barn door. He scrubbed it off before the boys could see, but the sting of it lingered. He worried about how these moments might affect his sons, how they might begin to doubt their place in the world. Jack decided to confront the issue head-on. One evening, he gathered the boys around the kitchen table and said, "I know people haven't always been kind to us, but what matters most is how we treat each other and how we treat others, no matter how they treat us." Caleb looked down at his hands. Micah fidgeted with his chair, and Eli leaned against Jack's side. "We can't control what people think," Jack continued, "but we can show them who we are, and who we are is a family." The words seemed to resonate. Over the next few years, the boys grew stronger, more confident in themselves and their place in Oak Hollow. Caleb became a leader among his peers, using his artistic talent to create murals that brought color and life to the town. Micah excelled in baseball, earning a spot on the high school team and mentoring younger players. Eli, once so shy and quiet, found his voice, becoming a favorite among his teachers and classmates for his kindness and humor. The town began to change, too. The same people who had once whispered behind Jack's back now greeted him warmly at the diner or stopped by the farmhouse to ask for his advice on home repairs. Mrs. Hargrove, who had once doubted Jack's ability to raise the boys, now called them the pride of Oak Hollow. Even Mr. Simmons, who had been so critical in the beginning, admitted one day, "You proved me wrong, Jack. Those boys are a blessing." Years later, as Jack sat on the porch with his grown sons watching the sun set over the fields, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Caleb, now an artist with his own studio in town, leaned against the porch railing, sketchbook in hand. Micah, who had become a teacher and coach, tossed a baseball back and forth with Eli, who was studying to become a veterinarian. They were no longer the wary, uncertain boys he had brought home all those years ago. They were men, strong, kind, and resilient, who had built a life and a legacy in a town that had once doubted them. "You did good, Dad," Caleb said, breaking the comfortable silence. Jack smiled, his heart full. "We did good," he replied. "Because in the end, family wasn't about where you came from or what people thought of you. It was about love, perseverance, and the unshakable belief that together you could overcome anything."